Slava Isusu Christu, glory to Jesus Christ. This is Father Jack Custer at St. Michael's Cathedral in Passaic, New Jersey, back with session 3 of our new series on Catholic social teaching. In the first 2 episodes of this series, we began to look at Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, one of the first statements of Catholic social teaching, specifically on the subject of labor, wages, and the relations between laborers and employers, and the role of the state in ordering the economic lives of its citizens. In the first session, we looked at some of the fundamental principles that Pope Leo brings to the discussion. And if you have not listened to session 1, I would encourage you to go back there and start there, rather than following along with me now. In session 2, we looked specifically at some of the practical considerations about the rights of workers, the obligations of workers, and the obligations of employers toward their laborers, and some of the abuses that Pope Leo pointed to in 1891. And as I said previously, we're talking about the very environment in which most of our ancestors emigrated. And we're talking about the very environment in which the Cathedral of St. Michael the Archangel in Passaic, New Jersey, was founded, literally surrounded by mills and factories in a neighborhood that has always been the first point of arrival for new immigrants. In 1891, those new immigrants came from various corners of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians, Germans, Jews. Nowadays, they are Mexicans, Dominicans, Hondurans, Colombians. And many of the questions are the same. I want to pick up at one of the more radical points in this encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, which always in the back of his mind is addressing the promises and the perils of socialism. And that is the whole subject of organized labor and strikes. And again, a little background is necessary here, just to keep it to incidents that would have involved Byzantine Catholics. In 1891, there was a massacre of workers who were agitating for better conditions at the Morewood mine in western Pennsylvania. This was one of the founding moments of what became the United Mine Workers Union. In 1892, steel workers in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the site of another one of our Byzantine Catholic cathedrals, steel workers went on strike in a movement that turned violent and ugly. In 1897, outside of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in our own eparchy of Passaic, there was another agitation at the Latimer mine, in which 19 men, more than half of them with Slavic names, were killed. This is another one of the major moments in the history of the United Mine Workers Union. So these sorts of agitations, these movements of workers reacting against what they saw to be abusive conditions, are front page news as Pope Leo is writing. And it's front page news that involves the very founders of our churches. Speaking about strikes, Pope Leo recognizes in number 36 of Rerum Novarum, strikes happen as a reaction against unfair hours or unfair wages. He recognizes that strikes threaten everyone. The striker loses his livelihood. The general public loses the commodity that the strikers were making. The entrepreneur, the employer, is losing his source of income. And Leo also recognizes, and this again is a sidelong glance at socialism, strikes, however they begin, with whatever justification they begin, will often attract what the English translation of the document calls firebrands. People who will infiltrate the movement and stir it up for their own bigger political purposes. Socialists were very, very active in some of these agitations and could very easily sway the simple and uneducated laborers who simply wanted better hours, better pay, better conditions, and may not have been educated enough to recognize when they were buying into a larger and poisonous movement such as socialism. Leo insists that strikes cannot threaten public order. They can't be violent. They can't do harm to persons or property. Very timely observation. And Leo says, since the issues are unfair hours or unfair wages, if the particular employer is unwilling to make concessions, the state should remove in good time the causes that lead to conflicts between employers and employed. And here we see the Pope's support for what come to be labor laws regarding working hours, overtime pay, minimum wage, occupational safety standards, in number 48, Leo says, employers and workmen can and should really resolve these things among themselves. Leo suggests that employers could be supporting associations and organizations that will offer aid to those who are in distress and which will provide a place for the two different classes, the wealthy and the laborer, to come together in collaboration. Now, this sort of thing did happen. There were industrialists, employers, capitalists who provided cultural activities for their laborers, libraries, reading rooms, English classes, home economics classes, all kinds of things to help their laborers become more acclimated to an American way of life and to prosper in it. I forget the names of the particular places, but there were places, especially in Western Pennsylvania, in some of the soft coal mines, where the mine owners would actually sponsor and build a church for the miners. The whole group of miners were of one religion, Greek Catholic as often as not, and part of the appeal to come work in my mine is I'll build you a church and get you a priest. That sort of employer is hearing what Pope Leo is saying. But much more importantly, it was the laborers themselves who organized. And in this context, there's not enough good you can say about a particular organization for our people. And that is the Greek Catholic Union, which was founded in 1892, I believe, and founded as an insurance society that provided burial insurance for the all too frequent deaths of laborers in mines or mills. It was a fraternal society in which members paid dues and from which they could expect some material support in case of need, some moral support. You were obliged as a Greek Catholic Union member to attend all the funerals in your lodge. The Greek Catholic Union also, long before we had a bishop, was kind of organizing the life of our church here in America because they were the only national organization for Greek Catholics. They provided educational material in the form of an annual calendar, a great big almanac that was maybe the only reading material in a person's house besides the prayer book, but it included all kinds of information about all kinds of subjects, not just religious, and literature and humor and everything else. A weekly newspaper, the Viestnik, the Messenger. By 1923, they had established an orphanage. And it was the Greek Catholic Union, until we had a resident bishop in 1924, and even after that, that was primarily the organization that looked out for the interests of working class Byzantine Catholics in the United States. The Holy Father strongly encourages just this kind of organization, whose foundations are religious, whose principles are mutual support, financially and morally, who help laborers to use their free time, their leisure time productively without falling into the all too available vices, and to provide for the special needs of the especially needy. It's kind of cute that when Pope Leo XIII thinks about unions, labor unions, he approves of the idea, but envisions it as a kind of continuation of the medieval guilds, in which all the members of a particular trade worked together for the common advancement of their trade and of the people who practiced it, so that they had the strength of numbers when dealing with the civil authority and with other powers in their community. And the medieval guilds were all religiously based. There are so many churches in Italy, for example, because every guild built its own little votive church for their own little purposes, apart from the parish church. And they sponsored their annual feast in honor of their patron saint. And within the guild, there was provision for the needs of widows, orphans, and so on. And there was mutual support in the practice of Catholic virtue. This is what Pope Leo envisions for unions, which he envisions to be founded on Catholic principles. He envisions Catholic unions. Well, the GCU is one good example of that, but it was never a labor union. It was a fraternal society. When I think back to my own childhood, certainly many of the existing unions in my neighborhood were overwhelmingly populated by Catholic men. Yet somehow we never thought to build labor unions on those principles. There's this dangerous separation in American society between what the individual Catholic does in his home and in his church, and what the individual Catholic does when he moves out into civil society. We have wonderful organizations like the Knights of Columbus or the Ancient Order of Hibernians for the Irish, in which Catholics have grouped together as a force in civil society, but that never happened in the labor movement. There was an organization called the Knights of Labor, and I don't know enough to know what became of it. But certainly by the time of the great labor boom of the 50s, our labor unions were entirely secularized. Pope Leo points out that it is the natural right of human beings to enter into free societies like a labor union or a fraternal society. And they derive from the basic instinct of human beings to dwell in society together, to form groups. And Leo makes a very, very pointed observation. The existence of labor unions is posited on exactly the same natural law as the existence of states. The human right and tendency to form societies. And there he's looking at the state and saying, you can't challenge the legitimacy of these unions without calling your own legitimacy as a national or local state into question. There are limits, however. Pope Leo says that the law can intervene to prevent associations which gather for purposes that are bad, unlawful, or dangerous. He also recognizes that some labor organizations in 1891 are in the hands of, I quote, secret leaders, and are managed on principles which are bad according with Christianity, which do not accord well with Christianity and with the public well-being, and that they do their utmost to get within their grasp the whole field of labor and force working men either to join them or to starve. The translation there is a little clumsy, but Leo is pointing to labor unions that were founded on socialist principles inimical to the dignity of the individual and the primary right of the family and the obligation of humanity to worship. And he's also pointing to a practice that could exist in many places, which forced laborers into unions they did not really wish to join. Join or starve. The principles that Pope Leo XIII lays down for associations of laborers. Imagine a situation that will always be true for new immigrants, but is less true as folks gain education and material comfort. it's always saddened me that in the United States, Catholics have failed to create really strong professional societies. The best example is probably Catholic lawyers. Catholic doctors, Catholic pharmacists have really failed to present any sort of united front against many of the attacks on human life, whether from abortion or contraception or euthanasia or sterilization or any of the variety of outrages against human life that occur within their professions. I'm unaware of a strong movement of Catholic doctors or Catholic pharmacists. And if I'm unaware of it, it suggests that it doesn't exist. By the same token, there are organizations in many big cities that were just de facto overwhelmingly Catholic. I think of the New York police or fire departments until very recently would have been overwhelmingly Irish and Italian Catholics. A strong Catholic organization for uniformed personnel, police, fire, EMTs, could do a lot of good and could maybe prevent some harm. There is a union of Catholic school teachers, but Catholic school teachers are a dwindling number. Much more important in our times would be a union, a professional organization of teachers in general, since most Catholics who teach probably teach in the parochials, in the public school system. Similarly for Catholic nurses. Similarly for Catholic businessmen. In Europe, one sees a bit more of this. One sees organizations of Catholic scientists, Catholic practitioners of economics. All of these fields about which Catholic teaching has much to contribute could really be organized in such a way that Catholics who belong to these professions and practice these professions are supporting each other and are nourished and further educated in the riches of their own faith. It would make them better practitioners of their own professions and would provide a powerful witness in our world. We fear those things in America. We fear them because they look exclusive and they look like somehow we are surrendering our autonomy or our freedom of thought. There's a point at which freedom of thought becomes freedom from thought. We have failed to educate our professional classes in our faith, especially as it impacts their profession, so that a Catholic doctor, a Catholic banker, a Catholic lawyer may well not sound any different, think any different from a lawyer, banker, or doctor who has no faith, because we've gotten so good at compartmentalizing our religious life, which may be very sincere, from our professional life, which may be really uninfluenced by our faith, except for some general principles like I should be good. I should be honest. There's so much more the church could teach. There's so much more professional societies could contribute. The Holy Father suggests that the church, here's where he gets Catholic. The Holy Father suggests that the church has a few things specifically to offer in this situation of tension and potential injustice between employers and laborers. The first thing is, he says, the church's proclamation of the moral law, specifically the 10 commandments, just focusing on two, the commandment to justice, thou shalt not steal, and the commandment against envy, thou shalt not covet, would do much to correct the abuses of both employers and laborers. Because one of the things Leo recognizes is that socialism gains strength by creating a sense of envy of the rich in the hearts of the poor. Injustice is one thing. Injustice is wrong. But envy is also wrong. And Leo rightly points out that these commandments that the church proclaims can reach the hearts of people because as instruments, they derive their effectiveness from God. They alone can reach the inmost heart and conscience and bring men to act from a motive of duty to control their passions. That means imbalanced, excessive emotions like anger and greed and envy. And appetites, that is, our desire for stuff. To love God and their fellow man with a love that is outstanding and of the highest degree, and to break down courageously every barrier which blocks the way to virtue. From that, Leo derives the second principle, that Christian life, by its very nature, leads to prosperity by teaching moderation, by restraining greed on the part of the employer and on the part of the laborer, and by an immoderate thirst for pleasure, that vice that could ruin a working man's life when he doesn't know what to do with this newfound money in his hand. Both sides have to avoid vice. Leo points especially to expensive vices, which would probably plague the rich more than the poor. But even alcoholism becomes a very expensive vice for the poor. Thirdly, Leo points to the direct intervention the church has always made in the lives of the poor, beginning with the description of the very first church in Jerusalem in 33 AD in the Acts of the Apostles. Acts chapter 4, verse 34 says that there were no needy within the community because everybody shared what they had. And Acts chapter 6 shows us how the church actually organized that work of charity through the Holy Order of Deacons. Specifically within the church, there's always been particular care for widows. That's how the deacons got founded. Orphans, the elderly, the sick, and the Holy Father includes the shipwrecked. What would we have to add to modernize that list a bit? Certainly the homeless. Last but not least, Leo points to Christian charity. Christian charity, he says, is drawn from the most sacred heart of Jesus Christ. Charity is our imitation of and our response to the total self-gift of Jesus Christ on the cross. The gift of Christ on the cross says that you and I, every human person, is of such value that Jesus would sacrifice himself for that person, for you, for me. Our act of charity recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of the needy person, the image and likeness of God. What St. Paul says, that brother for whom Christ died. That's Christian charity. And that insight that the human person is infinitely valuable is what makes it possible for me to say more valuable than my claim on these goods that I have. The Holy Father paints an interesting picture of what's possible. In the end, this is a very positive encyclical. This encyclical sees that work is necessary, that work is good, because work supports a family. And a family is where human beings made in the image and likeness of God come together in intimacy. And families build societies. Leo says this, I quote, "If a workman's wages are sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children, he will find it easy, if he is a sensible man, to practice thrift, and he will not fail, by cutting down expenses, to put aside some little savings and thus secure a modest source of income." End quote. Obviously, all this is possible only if he is allowed to exercise his right to private property. That picture he paints reminds me a little bit of an America I barely knew, the America of the post-World War II boom, the America of the GI Bill, the explosion of the suburbs, the access of a whole new class of people to college education, home ownership, automobile ownership, the kind of mobility that created on all levels. Labor, moderation, thrift, saving. How much of that's even still possible? If a recent college graduate were sitting here next to me, what would he or she say about their real prospects and opportunities given the actual employment conditions, the fact of college debt, the cost of housing, how much has changed in our experience in 2020 on the East Coast of the United States in an environment where all those factories that our grandparents and great-grandparents filled are now empty. What's different about the way people earn a living in the early 21st century? What new things would Pope Leo XIII see if he looked around today? Well, he'd certainly see an explosion of immoderation. He'd certainly see people thinking they need all kinds of things they don't need. He would certainly see a real weakness in family structures. That was always a problem for new immigrants. It's so typical for a young man to come over, attempt to establish himself, and then bring over the rest of his family. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The pages of the Greek Catholic Union Messenger are full of stories of broken families, bigamy, disappearances, failure to support. These things don't change. There will always be temptations. If once only alcohol was a problem, now drugs are a problem as well. What's changed and what's the same? Human beings are of infinite value and cannot be treated as tools. The family remains the only stable unit on which a society can be built, because it responds to the basic orientation and needs and desires of a man and a woman, and it naturally looks to the education and support of the young and the support of the elderly, until economic conditions break that family up. Is it still possible to save? Is it still possible to build some security for a future and to have something to leave to one's children? My generation will have something to leave to their children. Will their children? One thing Leo doesn't even recognize, he couldn't have, is just how this explosion of industrialization changed the face of the earth. And I'm talking about environmental issues. What price have we paid for prosperity? What damage did 100 years of an industrial boom do to nature? What habits have we learned in that 100 years of industrialization that can't be sustained or shouldn't be sustained? These are issues that later popes will address, most notably on environmental issues, Pope Francis. But already you see that it's impossible to separate our faith from these issues that you could call social or political, because they impact the most basic questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And how shall I live? For these things, the church has answers. And those answers derive not just from revelation, but from the common and recognized truth that comes from recognizing how human beings are and how the world is. This thing we call natural law. Glory to Jesus Christ.